So this webinar is organized by Greater Jakarta Transportation Authority, Ministry of Transportation of Indonesia, and Indonesian Embassy in Washington D.C., attended by Ministry of Transportation officials, as well as other related stakeholders in Indonesia. And now we would like to welcome the Honorable Ambassador of the Republic of Indonesia to the United States of America, Bapak Dubes Rosan Perkasa Roslani. And I would like to welcome the Director of Traffic Management, Greater Jakarta Transportation Authority, Ministry of Transportation of Indonesia, Bapak Sigit Irfansyah. Selamat malam, Pak Sigit. Thank you for your coming.
Selamat malam, Mas Ranto.
And of course, our speaker, I would like to welcome Dr. Christine Lewis, Principal Technical Advisor for Energy Analysis and Sustainability, U.S. Department of Transportation Volpe Center. Good morning, Dr. Lewis. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Pak Hananto. Thank you so much for having me. Can you hear me okay?
Okay, for the first time, to mark the beginning of our event, we will witness together the opening remark from the Honorable Ambassador of the Republic of Indonesia to the USA. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Bapak Dubes Rosan Perkasa Roslani. Bapak Dubes, screen is yours.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera bagi kita semua. Salam, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, dan salam kebajikan. Dr. Christine Lewis, Principal Technical Advisor for Energy Analysis and Sustainability, United States Department of Transportation. Bapak Sigit Irfansyah, Director of Traffic Management, Greater Jakarta Transportation Authority, Ministry of Transportation of Indonesia. Distinguished participants of the Knowledge Sharing Program, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for having me today at the Knowledge Sharing Program on the Freight and Fuel Transportation Optimization Tool by the United States Department of Transportation. This excellent program is particularly organized for the officers of the Ministry of Transportation of the Republic of Indonesia, the logistic industry practitioners, and the freight transport operators who will benefit greatly from this kind of optimization tool. Appreciations go to Ministry of Transportation of Indonesia for the initiative in overcoming the constraint posed by the COVID-19 pandemic by holding the sharing program from the United States Department of Transportation virtually. As such, the regulators and operators in Indonesia can learn the freight and fuel transport optimization tool effectively and efficiently without coming to the US. The logistic cost in Indonesia is still relatively high, reaching 23% of gross domestic product or GDP. Moreover, when compared to the other developed countries, such as the United States and the European Union, whose logistic costs are only 8% and 9% respectively, there is much room for Indonesia to make its logistic services more efficient and globally competitive. Distinguished guests, participants of Knowledge Sharing Program, ladies and gentlemen, from the regulator side, the government continues to strive to improve the performance of national logistics to increase the competitiveness of the national economy, one of which through structuring the national logistic ecosystem. Meanwhile, of course, the operators have also been competing to find the most optimal way to transport freight. However, considering the high percentage, it seems that Indonesia still needs benchmarking from other countries, in this case, the US, to take advantage of optimization tools like those successfully developed by the US Department of Transportation. As Ambassador to the Republic of Indonesia, to the United States of America, I'm very pleased to know that there is continuously knowledge sharing and webinar programs to enhance the cooperation between Ministry of Transportation of the Republic of Indonesia and the United States Department of Transportation. Distinguished officers, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to conclude my remarks by wishing the knowledge sharing program be a fruitful discussion forum. I also wish that the participants, both regulators and operators, can learn a lot and adopt the tool to gain the substantial benefits. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Bapak Dubes Rosan Perkasa Roslani, for the excellent opening remark. Please give virtual applause to Bapak Dubes Rosan, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. And the second opening remark will be delivered by Director of Traffic Management, Greater Jakarta Transportation Authority, Bapak Sigit Irfansyah. Pak Sigit, time is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Hananto. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Your Excellency, Ambassador of the Republic Indonesia to the United States of America, Bapak Rosan Perkasa Rostani, Principal Technical Advisor for Energy Analysis and Sustainability, the United States Department of Transport, Dr. Kristen Lewis, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening to all participants in Jakarta, and good morning for friends from DC. On behalf of the Greater Jakarta Transport Authority, Ministry of Transportation of the Republic Indonesia, it is my great pleasure and honor to welcome you all to this knowledge sharing program on the freight and fuel transportation optimization tools by the United States Department of Transport. Thank you for being these virtual events. I would also express my sincere honor to the Ambassador of the Republic Indonesia to the USA, who are willing to give his opening remark, and appreciate to the organization of the knowledge sharing program as an encouragement that get positive energy to all of us here. In this program, our primary agenda is sharing knowledge from the U.S. Department of Transport expert, Dr. Kristen Lewis. Good morning, Kristen. On the freight and the fuel transportation optimization tools and utilization in assisting decision mark to identify opportunity to the maximize efficiency and increase safety. I think is very useful in freight condition in Indonesia. Nowadays, the freight movement keep on increase and its demand is efficient as well as safety transport scenario. However, as mentioned by Bapak Rosan, logistic costs, particularly from the transport component, Indonesia are among the highest. Yet Indonesia poses tremendous potential. For example, the Greater Jakarta area, which has a very large industrial area, as one of the source of freight movement. Based on the Logistic Performance Index 2018, Indonesia is ranked 46, lagging behind the neighboring country in South Asia. The national logistic system that has been developed and its derivative action plan have not been able to solve various logistic problems in this country. In formulating policies and setting the delivery scenario, which can make the freight transportation efficient and safety, of course, it's required to understand and the transportation network, the nature of goods, the movement pattern, and all the constraints in detail and comprehensively. The US DOT successfully developed the optimizing tools that has been able to answer this end. It has helped many agencies to scenario that can reduce advantage risk and freight always as fuel transportations. It is undeniable that the transport condition along with the regulation and policy, also the resource capacity between the USA and Indonesia are indeed different. Still, I hope this knowledge sharing session supply us with more insight and fuel understanding in overcoming the freight transport issue by using the transport optimizing tool, especially from the USA experience. And it will be great if possible, later we can adopt this tool and apply in Indonesia case. Ladies and gentlemen, I am firmly convinced that your active participation and valuable contribution will provide substantial outcome toward the effort in improving the performance of freight transport as well as logistic system. Thank you for bringing your energy, knowledge, and expertise. I wish you all a fruitful discussion. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Sigit, for the opening remarks. Please give a virtual applause to Mr. Sigit Irfansyah. Thank you very much. Now it is the time to photo opportunity to our all panelists, speaker, and participant. Please look into your camera so that we can imagery that this moment, and please make sure that your camera is turning on. Screen number 1, please take a picture in 3, 2, 1, and smile. Okay, screen number 2. Take a picture in 3, 2, 1, and smile. The last screen. Take a picture in 3, 2, 1, and smile. Okay, thank you very much to our all speakers and participants. I know that we are looking forward to our next part of our webinar, the presentation from extraordinary speaker from United States Department of Transportation, Volpe Center. She will provide us with insight about the freight and fuel transportation optimization tools. Right after, of course, we will have question and answer session before the end of our webinar. To ask question, please put your question to the Q&A or chat box with a particular format. Type your name, space, question, or you can raise your hand. I repeat, to ask question, please put your question to the Q&A or chat box with the particular format. Type your name, space, question, or raise your hand. So without further ado, on behalf of the organizing committee, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our knowledge sharing webinar, a dedication from the Ministry of Transportation of Indonesia and Embassy Indonesia in Washington D.C. The presentation will be given by Dr. Christine Lewis. Dr. Christine Lewis is Principal Technical Advisor for Energy Analysis and Sustainability. Dr. Lewis joined US DOT in 2009 with a focus on resilience in transportation, alternative fuels, sustainability, and environmental impact risk assessment. Dr. Lewis received the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientist and Engineer from President Barack Obama in 2011. Bravo, Dr. Lewis, and has received numerous US DOT and Volpe Directors Award. Dr. Lewis received a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry and Studies in the Environment from Yale and a PhD in Organismic and Evolutionary Biology from Harvard University. Okay, once again, good morning, Dr. Lewis. Dr. Lewis,
Good morning.
screen is yours. Please.
Thank you very much again, and good morning and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for the chance to be here today. I'm going to share my slides, and hopefully that will be visible to you. Okay, great. So today, as has already been eloquently described, I'm going to talk to you about a tool we've been building actually for about 10 years now, the Freight and Fuel Transportation Optimization Tool, or what we call for short FTOT. So you'll hear me say FTOT a lot for the next half hour or hour. And this is a tool that we have been building in collaboration with our sponsors. And I wanted to quickly just give you a sense of the place where I work so you can understand how that happens. So I'm at the Volpe National Transportation Systems Center, which is part of the US Department of Transportation. And the way we work is we are basically supporting agencies from across the federal government, but particularly in DOT, as well as agencies outside of the federal government, state DOTs, private entities, and international entities to develop transportation solutions. So we are a federal agency, but we're actually a fee-for-service agency, and we're one of the few agencies within the US Department of Transportation that's truly multimodal. So we work across modes, across disciplines to bring solutions to the table on transportation. So we don't actually get any funding from Congress. All of our funding comes from our sponsors, our other agencies or organizations that need help with transportation challenges. So that will give you a sense as we go through. There are a few places in the presentation where I talk about our sponsors for FTOT, and that is the context in which that occurs. So what is this tool, FTOT? FTOT was really built to be a flexible scenario testing tool. It's not an operational tool that says, hey, I'm about to send this truck out, where should I send it? It's really for looking at scenarios for supply chains and freight movements across the transportation network. This tool was created in support of the Federal Aviation Administration. And we've also had sponsorship from the Department of Energy and the Office of Naval Research, all within US government. And is now being considered to be adapted for freight planning and analysis, specifically for the sort of state freight long-range planning process by Federal Highway Administration. So we've had multiple sponsors, but the FAA has been engaged all the way along and continues to be the primary sponsor for the development of FTOT. The tool is available on GitHub. It has been available since 2019. It is completely open source, so all the code is available. You can download and adapt and use it. You can fork directly off our GitHub repository and work within the, within the code from there. So it is a tool that anyone can use. That said, I do want to mention that right now the tool is a continental US-based tool, and I'll talk a little bit about why that's the case as we go forward in terms of the data sources that we use. And we can talk about adaptability toward the end. So the goal of this tool is to take a large-scale scenario or a small-scale scenario, national down to regional, and optimize the routing and flow of material in the supply chain or the freight scenario to maximize delivery at the endpoints and minimize the cost. It's built fundamentally on a GIS-based multimodal network, and then there's a Python-based optimization module that functions on top of that to do that flow assignment and allocation. And it is a multimodal network of road, rail, waterway, pipeline for crude oil and products, and multimodal facilities that connect them that determine where you can switch modes. One of the things that's unique about the FTOT model is that it is a supply chain oriented use case. So you can start with the sort of simplest case of, I've got a bunch of starting points, I've got a bunch of ending points. I want to move stuff through the transportation network to get things there and minimize my cost. But what FTOT allows you to do is layer in additional steps in the process. And that allows you to look at supply chains that have transformation or aggregation of material along the way. So you can have raw materials coming from a set of starting points, going through processing facilities and going downstream to their destination. And at that processing facility, the material can actually change identity. So it can go from being, say, crude oil to jet fuel and diesel, or fruit and sugar to jam, or jam and pie. And so there are different commodities that you can track in both the raw material form and that processed form. The third case that we can support is FTOT can actually generate potential processing locations. If you're looking at a future supply chain, you don't know where you want to process the material, you don't have facilities located yet, FTOT can say, what's the best general area from a transportation perspective where I might put processing facilities, and that can highlight candidate locations where you can do more detailed siting analyses, but it gives you a sense of the efficient locations for putting processing points or aggregation points based on the need for transporting the material through the supply chain. And then what we've done is we've basically made this more and more flexible so that you can have multiple commodities, multiple time steps, different steps in the supply chain. So rather than just origin, one processor, one destination, you can have many steps in the process. And so we've tried to make this tool very flexible. It does allow you to look at different types of commodities, and it allows you to adjust a lot of different aspects of the supply chain characteristics and the facility characteristics, as well as the network itself. So I mentioned that this is an optimization tool, and it really right now is focused on optimizing for cost. So it takes the straight up transportation costs that you would expect. How much does it cost on a per ton mile basis to move something on road versus rail versus water, for example. And in the case of pipelines, we use designated tariff costs that are designated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in the US for the pipelines that we include. We also have a cost for switching modes because it's not free to move from, say, road to rail. And we also incorporate something in the network that basically penalizes routes that you are less preferable. So an example in the US would be if you have an interstate highway and a small road right next to it, you want the flows to go on the interstate highway. That's the largest road type in the US. And so what we do is we add an impedance or a penalty to smaller and smaller roads to encourage things to flow on the larger roads, all other things being equal. Things like that are in actually all of the modes in the network. Because it has that supply chain oriented approach, we also can put in information about facility characteristics. So at your origin points, you designate how much material there is. At your processing points, whether it's storage or aggregation or transformation, you can put in the minimum amount of material that facility needs to function, the maximum amount of material it can handle, and what goes in versus what comes out, how much goes in versus how much comes out for each type of product. So in the case of, for example, lumber, you might take in felled trees in a very raw form. It might go to a facility that has a certain capacity for taking in those logs. And then the outputs might be wood chips and paper pulp, and you would get different amounts of those products coming out. And the tool can take that into account and push the right amount of material downstream and allocate it over the network to the appropriate destinations. Now, if you think about optimizing for cost, it's always cheapest never to move anything. So the model is driven by demand at the destination, and we penalize the model for not meeting that demand. And that's what pushes material through the process, through the model. And then we have an option to include modal flow capacity. And what we mean by that is the maximum number of trucks that can pass over a road length, for example, or the maximum number of train cars that can pass over a rail link can be included in the modeling, and the background flows, what's already happening, can also be included so that the tool will then route on the path that's least cost until it's full at a designated level, and then it will switch to a secondary route, and then it will switch to a third route. So with the modal flow capacity, we can actually reflect more than one route per origin destination pair. Now, I mentioned that the models right now is a continental US model. It is based on US government resources. So we use the Federal Highway Administration's Freight Analysis Framework. I'll note that we currently have Framework 4 in there. The FAF 5 has just been released in the past week, and we do plan to update all of our network elements to the most recent now that that is out. We use the Federal Railroad Administration's All Rail Network, the U.S. Army Corps' Inland and Coastal Waterways, so it does not have the long distance shipping waterways or paths that one might use. And then the pipeline data in the US are restricted in terms of our ability to see at a very granular level where they physically occur. So we're using a public schematized data set, but we've adjusted that to real station locations. So you get on and off pipelines at real locations, even though the actual pipeline path may not reflect specific reality. And then we incorporate that with those pipeline tariff data that I mentioned earlier, which basically determine where you can get on and where you can get off the pipeline. And I understand that Indonesia does not have a lot of pipeline right now, so might not be as much of interest, but I thought I would point it out because it's kind of a unique mode that we've incorporated in that way. And then, as I mentioned, the multimodal facilities are locations where material can cross from one mode to another, and there's a penalty associated with that in the modeling. I do also want to mention, so this is a continental US model. The code is currently geared toward these data sets. We have been exploring the option of potentially transforming the modeling approach to use a generalized modeling network specification, or GMNS, which has recently been developed to enable people to use models across networks. That has not been executed. We don't currently have the resources for that, but it is something we've been exploring, and that would enable something like using the optimization functions in FTOT on a different network. But right now it is a continental US network, which doesn't mean that the elements of it couldn't be adapted, but it is not exactly ready-made to do that. So the way FTOT works is it is really a scenario testing tool rather than a data querying tool. So there are some underlying data elements in there, but for the scenario for your supply chain or your freight analysis, you really bring that information to the table. So the user determines where your origin points are and how much material is available to come out of them, where your destinations are and what the demand is of those destinations. And then if you are interested in the more detailed supply chain approach, the intermediate points or processing facilities can be fed into the model, or they can also be generated by the model. And then there are a whole bunch of elements that can be added to the modeling to adjust it to regional or local conditions, including the transport costs, the vehicle type, various elements of the network, and so on. And then what you can do is create hypothetical scenarios or future scenarios of concern. So you can change the network, for example, by adding an element, like adding a bridge. What will happen to this supply chain when this new bridge exists? Or I'm concerned about flooding under a given storm condition. You knock out the links in the network and you see how things would change under that hazard condition. So you can change those elements. You can also change things related to the supply chain itself. I expect more agricultural production, and so I want to see what would happen. Or I expect, certain facilities to be developed. And so those are the kinds of variations you can create, and then play around with those and see how they affect the optimal solution. And what FTOT gives you once you've defined those scenarios is the optimal routing and flow of your material on the transportation network that you're using, which facilities are used based on that optimal solution. So the tool is not required to use every origin, every destination, every processing facility. It uses the best combination of those to achieve the solution. And then it reports the scenario and commodity specific costs, emissions, vehicle miles traveled, number of vehicle loads, and mileage. So the emissions and so on are not part of the optimization. It's really those costs and penalties and the elements of the supply chain that are part of the optimization, but they are part of the reported output. And then we have ways to help the user compare the baseline scenario versus the variance, so you can see how things compare to each other, what the performance improvement or degradation is. And then we really do, because we're thinking about this from a supply chain oriented approach, we're really interested in being able to track and optimize multiple materials at the same time. So the tool can just do bulk freight. You can just say, I've got tons of stuff and I want it to go from here to there, and I want it to go through this type of facility, and that's fine. But with the FTOT supply chain function, you can actually track multiple raw materials, and those can go through different facility types and have different downstream materials, as I mentioned. And then in order to visualize the results, we have some Tableau dashboards that allow you to look at maps of the candidate facilities. What could you have used versus what the tool actually selected, the optimal routing and mode choice. And then you can break that down in various ways, by the commodities, by the mode. So you can look at it for raw materials, you can look at it for processed materials, you can look at it individually by different commodities. And then these dashboards also allow you to look at a single scenario or compare scenarios and look at the change in the different metrics with those changes in your scenario. One of the elements that we found there's been a lot of interest in with the model is resilience testing. So what we want to know is, how good is this solution? And we're always looking for the best solution, but how good is this solution under disruption? And so we have a couple different ways that one can investigate this. One is a manual process where you say, like I said, you're concerned about a particular flooding scenario or a particular bridge being lost or something like that. You can knock that out in the network and see how that performs and how that changes things. But the other thing that we've implemented is a rank and removal process for the links in your optimal solution. So every link gets a ranking according to its importance, and that importance is really up to the user. We have used a default metric called betweenness centrality, which basically says, how often is this link used in the optimal solution for how much material? And then when we have that metric for every link in the network, we can then rank all the links. And then every link can be removed sequentially, starting with the most important. And we can see how that changes the optimal solution scenario cost and how it changes the routing and allocation. And so that change in cost indicates whether or not that link has a big effect on the performance of your optimal network, of your optimal solution. And what you can see here in the lower on the right is a graphic showing as you remove different links, how does your network solution change? And then here on the bottom, as you remove links, your cost goes up because you're more disrupted, so you're less able to meet the optimal solution that the tool originally found. And what you can see is as you remove links, you see a change in cost, and certain links have an outsized impact on that cost change. And so that can lead you to further investigations. Is it really the aggregation of all these different losses, or is that link particularly important? If I move that link up in importance, how does that change things? So it gives you an opportunity to understand the stability of your solution and help you identify areas of vulnerability. So we've been using this tool for a number of different types of scenarios. The first is looking at supply chain, leveraging that supply chain focus. And we've looked at this at the national scale in the US and also looking at regional analyses. And as I mentioned, you can vary a lot of different things in order to look at that supply chain exploration. You can change the number of steps or the facility locations in your supply chain. I want to put in a new processing facility. I want to separate my, oil, vegetable oil extraction from my, some other supply chain process downstream. Or I want to have a raw sugar mill and then a refined sugar mill. So you can change that in the model and see how that affects your solution. You can vary how much material is being moved of different types of commodities. You can vary the facility characteristics. And then, as I mentioned, you can generate potential processing locations that you can evaluate further and then narrow down your options. And then we have these resilience testing functions as well. So, really a range of ways of looking at solutions to the freight or supply chain movements. But again, not an operational model, really a screening level model. So here's an example of analysis we did in collaboration with FAA and the Department of Energy in the National Renewable Energy Lab, looking at future jet fuel supply chains for waste-based alternative jet fuel or sustainable aviation fuel. And in this analysis, our colleagues at the National Renewable Energy Lab used their biomass scenario model to apply different policies to the potential to produce jet fuel, bio-based jet fuel, waste-based jet fuel, and then looked at how those incentives could drive forward the production of jet fuel based on how many policies were implemented. And then what we did was we took a snapshot of that and ran it through FTOT and looked at if we had that level of deployment, where might we expect it to happen and how might we expect to deliver sustainable jet fuel to airports. So, and this paper is out in peer-reviewed literature, so it gives you a sense of the kinds of analyses you can do at this national or larger scale level. We've also worked with a number of collaborators at the more regional scale, looking at smaller areas and specific types of supply chains, including canola-based jet fuel production in the upper Midwest of the US, and a number of different collaborations looking at sustainable aviation fuel from various types of woody biomass and other oil seeds. We've also been collaborating with colleagues at Washington State University to apply a different type of resilience testing that really takes into account fragility of different infrastructure assets and basically looks at the potential for disruption of the supply chain. And we anticipate releasing a version of that in the next couple of months. And we've also been looking at maritime fuel supply chains with Department of Energy and NREL, and also supply chains for an agricultural material, hemp, with Oregon State University. And a number of those are still ongoing. We've also been working on understanding the potential for FTOT to help look at existing freight supply chains and their intersection with planned transportation projects. So, understanding how an agency, a transportation agency that's planning on doing something to their transportation network can intersect with those supply chains and what the implications are. and then also looking at that resilience testing. So on the right is an example that we did in Louisiana, looking at the sugar supply chain, looking at production at the parish level or equivalent of a county level, production of sugarcane going to a raw sugar processing mill, going downstream to a refined sugar processing mill, and ending at the port of Greater Baton Rouge. And what we saw in this scenario was we were able to accurately reflect, using FTOT, the reality of the patterns of use of the transportation network of the sugar supply chain in the region. It turns out everything in this supply chain was moved by road, hence being red. In FTOT, the different modes are different colors. And what we did was then overlaid planned transportation projects that the agency, that the state agency was planning on doing, and saw where those intersected with the supply chain. And that gave a new opportunity for the agency to then go to the supply chain stakeholders and say, hey, we're planning this project, it's going to intersect with your supply chain, it's going to impact what you're doing, you know, let's have a conversation about how to limit those challenges. And then what we did was we did a more detailed study on the sugar supply chain, looking specifically at one subset, a small sugarcane cooperative, that gave us more detailed information at the farm level about where they were producing sugarcane and their own processing facilities, and going to that same Port of Baton Rouge destination. And just for clarity, we haven't included all the facilities on this map, but basically what we saw was we were able to reflect their truck route choices accurately in FTOT, and they said, we have this defunct rail link. We're interested in rebuilding that rail link and enabling it to take some of our materials downstream. What would that do to our optimal solution? And what we did in FTOT was we added that link into the network, and we were able to see that the optimal solution indeed shifted a lot of material to the rail network from road. The rail network is in pink here, and able to estimate that on an annual basis, this would replace 6,000 truckloads of molasses and raw sugar with 1,600 rail cars. And obviously for the agency, that had a lot of implications for road wear, maintenance needs, congestion, but also for the sugar cooperative, gave them a sense of the reduction in transport cost, fuel burn, and emissions that they could associate with that change. So it gave them a way of investigating that scenario very quickly. So just to reiterate, FTOT is publicly available, and the code is completely available. We are always happy to answer questions. On the website, there's a full documentation, a technical documentation, and also a set of quick start scenarios, which are sort of like a tutorial with default data sets, so you can try the tool and see how it works and get sort of trained up on it. We do release new versions quarterly. We just released a new version a couple of weeks ago, so we're constantly bringing in new functionality, and that current development is sponsored by the Federal Aviation Administration, with a particular lens toward sustainable aviation fuel supply chains. If you do try out the tool and you identify issues or bugs, or you have a request, that can be raised on our GitHub site, and we always welcome feedback and suggestions, and always we're open to additional projects and collaborations, based on our approach of working with various sponsors. So my contact information is here. I want to acknowledge our sponsors at FAA, Federal Highways, Department of Energy, and Oregon State, and also past sponsorship from the Office of Naval Research. I know that some folks had sent in questions prior to the presentation. Hopefully I answered a few of them along the way, but I'm happy to go through those and also happy to answer any additional questions. So Takananto, I'll turn it back to you to moderate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and please give virtual applause to Dr. Christine Lewis. Thank you for your excellent presentation. From Dr. Lewis' presentation, we knew that there is a big effort to create this FTOT. With the FTOT, we can find the optimal route and flows between origin and destination. If I'm not mistaken, in the beginning of the presentation, Dr. Lewis mentioned that FTOT has two important modules, which are optimization modules and geographic information system, or GIS, that enable powerful mapping and display capabilities. I think from Indonesian side, your FTOT concept and utilization is a kind of valuable lesson learned not only for government purpose in the Ministry of Transportation, but also other transportation stakeholders in Indonesia. Thank you once again, Dr. Luis, for your excellent presentations. Now, after listening to speakers' presentations, it is the time for other participants to be involved because we are entering the Q&A sessions. And on behalf of the organizing committee, we apologize in advance if your question cannot be read because the amount of the question against our time limit. And now I would like to read the question that came in and has been created by the organizing committee in Ministry of Transportation of Indonesia. The first question, committee, please. Yeah. The first question is from Mr. Made. Mr. Made is lecturer in Land Transport Polytechnic in Bali. His question is, this tool is great and pivotal to focus on optimizing the logistics sector and green energy. There are some questions about this tool. Can we use different software such as QGIS, Quantum GIS, which is a free tool connected to FTOT? And what is the benefit of advanced S3 tools other than basic or standard S3 tools to support FTOT? And is there any document or simulation video about how to run this FTOT? Dr. Luis, you can answer the question.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Made, for these great questions. So I love the fact that you asked about QGIS, and it is something we've looked into in the past. You can't use QGIS directly in FTOT. It does require an ArcGIS Pro license because we do run specialized geoprocessing tools to prepare the data and visualize the results. But you could use QGIS after running FTOT to help visualize the outputs or sort of explore the results. But unfortunately, it doesn't natively run with QGIS. In terms of the benefit of advanced Esri versus basic or standard, I think you're referring to the licensing levels. We do use some of the advanced Esri license level features like the feature to line, feature to vertices to points, a couple other things that are leveraged by the tool. We do have some workarounds in each case to allow FTOT to run with a lower Esri license level, but we haven't probably identified every potential unexpected behavior or performance issue that might come with those because it does leverage some of those more advanced functions. But we do try to have a workaround so people who have a lower license level can use it. I will also mention that currently the version that we're working with in FTOT, the most recent version, is ArcGIS Pro and Python 3, but we do have an older version still maintained and available on our website that used ArcGIS and Python 2. So that is still available if that is an issue. And then the last question was, is there a module or simulation video about how to run FTOT? And again, I love that you asked this question. We do have all that documentation that I mentioned, including those tutorials on the website. And there is a video for the resilience testing function, but we're actually working on more of a tutorial video. And so we're expecting those to be released in late June, early July with our next FTOT release. So I apologize that I don't have a demo video to run for you today, but I look forward to being able to share that soon. And that will go up on our GitHub site.
Thank you, Dr. Luis. Please let us share the video when you finish your video in June. Okay, we move to the second question. The second question is from Mr. Fadli. He is from Human and Resource Bureau, Ministry of Transportation of Indonesia. The current FTOT scenario and analysis, as you explained, tends to accommodate the needs of business-to-business, B2B supply chain or distribution process, such as distribution of raw material to processing location, then to commodity distribution destination. One of our peer team's mission is to anticipate emerging transportation issues. Is it possible that in the future development of TOT can accommodate supply chain optimization for business to customer, B2C needs that serve door-to-door distribution, which is currently developing a lot, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic? Dr. Christine, please, you can answer the question.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Fadli, for these questions. And you're right, the door-to-door distribution has become a bigger and bigger issue. With the current incarnation of FTOT, we use the freight analysis framework for our road network. And the freight analysis framework by Federal Highways is really focused on roads that are primarily used for freight. And therefore, it does not include smaller, really smaller roads. It includes, if you're familiar with the classification system that Federal Highways uses, primarily classes 1 through 4, and then a smattering of 5 through 7, depending on the need for certain access roads and things like that. So our current version of FTOT would not be good for doing that really detailed door-to-door distribution. That said, if we're able to go ahead and modify our network functions so that we use that generic modeling network specification that I mentioned earlier, that would potentially enable someone to bring in a more detailed network, and then the tool would run on that fine. It's not constrained in terms of the number of links that it would run. It would just take a really long time. So you'd have a trade-off between having those really detailed road networks and the scale at which you could do analyses efficiently.
Thank you, Dr. Luis. Now we move to question number 3 from Mr. Nanda. He is lecturer in Railway Academy, Madiun, East Java. I would like to know about the data collection process. I believe that you have many transportation infrastructure layers in GIS, such as airport, port, highway, railway, pipeline, and so on. Is there any difficulty to collect those layers among different agencies in USDOT? This is about the coordination. How long have you developed this FTOT? How many years do you create this FTOT application in Volby Center? Dr. Luis, you can answer the question.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Nanda. So great question. And we've been fortunate that on the US government side, there's been really a push for data to be transparent and publicly available. So we do use the publicly available data that the US government puts out. I would say the challenges that we face, there have been a couple of challenges that we faced. One is just that, we then have to wait for those agencies to put out their newest version. So for example, the Freight Analysis Framework 5 was just released last week, but we've had updated data on the rail network, for 6 or 8 months that we, didn't want to implement until we were going to update the road network so that we could do it all at once. So sort of aligning the data timeframes and getting them at a point where we can do them efficiently has sometimes, been a challenge, just because the agencies themselves aren't necessarily on the same schedule for release. The other challenge that we had, and I mentioned it earlier, is on the pipeline side. Pipeline location data are restricted in the US. So originally we used the Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration restricted data set because we were doing internal analyses only. When we went to make this a public tool, we did have to switch to that Public Energy Information Administration version of the network to make sure that we could disseminate the tool publicly. And then lastly, the pipeline, and again, pipeline's unique, and I know it's not as big an issue for you, but with the pipeline, we needed to purchase a proprietary data set to enable us to efficiently link up tariffs and origin destination pairs. We were able to get permission from the vendor to generalize those data and include them in our public release, but we had to have a special agreement with them for that. So hopefully that answers your question on the network.
Thank you, Dr.
We've been
Luis.
developing the tool for 10 years, sorry.
Oh, 10 years, okay, thank you. Thank you for your answer. I see that the participant raised his or her hands, 2 participants. The first one is Mr. Febri. Mr. Febri is from Greater Jakarta Transport Authority, or BPTJ. Mr. Febri, I'll give you the opportunity to ask directly to Dr. Luis. You can open your mic. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Pak Hananto. Dr. Christine, I'm Febri from Greater Jakarta Transport Authority, and I have 2 questions for you. My first question is, in using these tools, of course, adequate infrastructure is needed. such as in United States of America. Can this be applied in Indonesia with the condition of the road network that is deemed inadequate, especially when the use of more transfer facility for the transportation of goods isn't optimal? And my second question is, what type of road network do you use as a layer input in geospatial information system? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Febri, for your questions. So I'll start with the road network type. We do use a GIS-based network. It is the Freight Analysis Framework network from Federal Highways. And one of the key things for FTOT, for any network element, is it has to be completely flowable. And what that means is that the elements that you would drive on are actually linked up in the model so that you can move something across the transportation network. And what we found at times when we looked at transportation network data is that things aren't necessarily linked up, and there are gaps in the data that aren't actual gaps in the network in reality. And so we do need a flowable network in order to use an FTOT. And currently we are using that freight analysis framework. In terms of your question about adequate infrastructure, I think that's an interesting challenge. Because in your case, what you're talking about is not gaps in the data, but gaps in reality, right? Places where the network is deficient. And so I think with FTOT, it would be reflected in the geographic information data that you would provide, in the sense that if something were impassable, you would want that to be reflected in the model. If you have a flowable network, but the reality is that certain pieces are not functional, then you could manually take those pieces out and make it so that the tool has to reroute away from those areas. The other value in the approach with FTOT is that you can add a link that doesn't currently exist and see what the benefit is. But I do just want to also mention again, this currently is a continental US-based tool. So it would take adaptation of the model in order to make it work in Indonesia per se. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Luis. Thank you, Mr. Febri, for your questions. And we move to question number 4 in our presentation, in our slide. Please, committee. Question number 4 is from Mr. Tangguh. He is working in Transport Policy Agency, Ministry of Transportation of Indonesia. Regarding data collection process, do you update periodically the data input? Is that monthly or annually? For example, if there is a new port, airport, or highway network, will you update the data directly? Dr. Luis, please, you can answer the question.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Tangguh, for this question. So as I was describing with the network, what we do with the network is whenever an agency releases new information, we take that in and we try to do an update consistently across the network as soon as we have at least multiple pieces of the network that have been updated. I would say the frequency of releases unfortunately does vary. So the freight analysis framework for road only updates, I think, every 5 years. So sometimes we have interim updates that don't include a road update, but do include the other modes. And the pipeline data for tariffs and OD pairs we get annually, because sometimes the direction of the pipelines changes. And so that's really important for our modeling, and we can get it annually. In terms of things like airports and so on, we do have a default airport layer, and we do have other information that's kind of default in there. But really the user, if you're interested in something in a scenario that incorporates airports, you probably would want to bring your own scenario to the tool, or at least double check that all the airports that you're interested in are represented the way you would like in the model. So because it's not a data querying tool, it's not a tool that stores a ton of data and then you see what you pick out flows. You actually bring the origins and destinations to the model, or at least check the default ones that we have. That would be partly on us and partly on the user. Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Dr. Luis. Now I will move to the chat box. Dr. Luis, actually there is a question in chat box from Pak Niko, Dr. Luis, Pak Niko Jayasinga from Land Transportation Polytechnic in Bekasi. I'll take question number 2. What the trend and future of supply chain technology? Can you explain about the current and future of SCM? I mean that SCM, supply chain management. Do you have any idea about it, Dr. Luis?
About the future of supply chain management, I would say, so you asked a couple different questions, and now I found it in the chat. So thank you for sharing it. In terms of supply chain technology trends, this is not something that we are using in FTOT, but we're certainly seeing a lot of development and deployment of blockchain, different ways of basically using secure information management system, digital information management systems to track material through the transportation network. And I think, you know, one of the key elements of that is related to being able to track materials efficiently for the purposes of ensuring its performance against various criteria and supply chain metrics like sustainability, or, you know, making sure that the origin is known and things like that. That's probably about as much as I can say about supply chain management trends.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Luis. The last question, we don't have much time. We move to presentation slide, please. Question number 5. From Mr. Made, yes, Mr. Made, still Mr. Made from Land Transportation Polytechnic Bali. There are many inputs in the example of FTOT data. If there is no specific data like pipeline data, can we run it separately? As in Indonesia, we don't have yet pipeline transportation. Or the simplest one is, can we modify your FTOT for Indonesian purpose? This is the Mr. Made question.
Thank you again, Mr. Made. So it is possible to modify the tool in order to work in Indonesia. It would take development work, and in particular would also require appropriate network data, flowable network data, to use the sort of functions of the tool on top of the Indonesian network. And there are certain attributes of the network that FTOT would look for that you would need to have in order to do that. So it is possible, it is not ready-made to do it. In terms of your question about modes, within FTOT, we have, when you select to run a scenario, you can select which modes you include, and you can also select which commodities can move on which modes. And pipeline is a great example of that. You can either drop pipeline entirely, or you can say, I want to include pipeline, but clearly not every commodity can go on a pipeline. So then you designate which commodities can flow on the pipeline. And likewise for the other modes, you can say, I want to run a rail only scenario, or I just want to exclude, you know, water. And you can then also assign commodities to the individual modes. So in terms of the functionality that exists, but again, in terms of applying it to Indonesia, there would be development required to enable the tool to use the Indonesian data.
Thank you, Dr. Luis. One last question from chat box. From Mr. Solihin, Greater Jakarta Transportation Authority. This is in Indonesia. Can you explain to us about the role and responsibility of USDOT in terms of logistic system in United States?
That's a big and interesting question. Certainly from the federal highways side, there's a tremendous amount of support to state DOTs and metropolitan planning organizations to think about how freight intersects with their planning process. And there have been some studies recently focused on assessing the what's called the fluidity of the transportation network and specific supply chains. In terms of actually executing the supply chain logistics, that falls on the private sector, but providing the infrastructure falls on the government side. And so the government, you know, is interested in understanding how decisions related to infrastructure intersect with those supply chains to make them more functional. I hope that answered your question, but I'm happy to answer a follow-up question if there was something specific you wanted me to try and address.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Luis. Unfortunately, due to the time constraint, this will be the end of a Q&A session. We apologize for the other questions that are not read and answered by our expert, Dr. Luis. Dr. Luis, is there any statement before we close the Q&A session?
All I would just say is you're very welcome to reach out to us on our GitHub site or to me directly. And I really, really appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to share this tool and our experience with you. And I hope that you find it useful. Thank you very much. And thank you again for the invitation, Pak Nanto.
Okay, the next session is the certificate. We humbly present the certificate to Dr. Luis. Of course, right now we will present it virtually. Please, the certificate committee, yes. Thank you for your time and your valuable lesson learned for Indonesian stakeholder. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, we have come to the end of our knowledge sharing session on the freight and fuel transportation optimization tool by Dr. Luis from United States Department of Transportation Poppy Center. Today, Indonesian government has been accelerating transportation infrastructure development all over the country. I think that soft infrastructure like FTOT should be also developed in Indonesia to enhance freight movement more efficient and competitiveness in Indonesia. Dr. Luis, thank you very much for your kind assistance. We really appreciate your knowledge sharing on the freight and fuel transportation optimization tool. We hope that you are still available to assist us in Indonesia in the future, notably for enhancing transportation sector in Indonesia. And on behalf of the organizing committee, I would like to express gratitude to our speaker for today and also all of our participants. Thank you. See you later. Stay safe, stay healthy, and God bless us all. Let's give applause to all of us. And now you leave the meeting. Thank you very much.
Pergerakan angkutan barang erat kaitannya dengan pertumbuhan ekonomi. Terlebih bagi wilayah Jabodetabek telah bertumbuh menjadi suatu kawasan aglomerasi. Sesuai dengan tugas dan fungsinya, Badan Pengelola Transportasi Jabodetabek (BPTJ) diharapkan mampu memadukan dan mengintegrasikan tata ruang dengan kebutuhan mobilitas masyarakat serta pergerakan barang sehingga menghasilkan aksesibilitas serta konektivitas layanan transportasi melalui sistem jaringan transportasi perkotaan yang terintegrasi, terkoordinasi, dan berkelanjutan. Sistem angkutan barang yang efektif dan efisien dibutuhkan untuk menjaga pertumbuhan serta pergerakan perekonomian. Kinerja angkutan barang yang tidak dapat diandalkan dapat berimbas pada terganggunya pertumbuhan ekonomi. Terlebih setiap hari terdapat 88 juta pergerakan masyarakat di Jabodetabek. Dalam mendukung kinerja sistem angkutan barang, selain pembangunan infrastruktur transportasi, peran sumber daya manusia termasuk pengemudi tidak dapat dikesampingkan. Kontribusi pengemudi yang terampil dibutuhkan untuk menjamin lancarnya pergerakan barang seperti di Jabodetabek dengan kawasan industri yang tersebar kurang lebih di 21 lokasi. Di sisi lain, Jabodetabek juga menyumbang 20% dari pergerakan ekonomi nasional. Jika tidak dibenahi, transportasi yang seharusnya menjadi urat nadi perekonomian justru akan menjadi beban perekonomian. Selain faktor keselamatan, peningkatan keterampilan pengemudi juga akan mempengaruhi kelancaran pergerakan masyarakat di Jabodetabek. Apabila terdapat gangguan perjalanan, tentunya akan berdampak pada kerugian baik materi maupun non-materi. Selain menindaklanjuti salah satu rekomendasi dari Komite Nasional Keselamatan Transportasi, kondisi tersebut juga menjadi salah satu alasan BPTJ menyelenggarakan kegiatan bimbingan teknis, peningkatan keterampilan dan kompetensi bagi pengemudi angkutan barang.
Menurut saya sih sangat bagus sih Pak. Pertama sangat bagus, kedua sangat membantu para driver sih. Intinya kita tuh tahu cara pengereman ya bagus kayak apa, kedua mobilnya tuh kayak apa. Ya manfaat bagi kita sih, semoga insiden kecelakaan di jalan raya itu bisa terkurangi. Saya sudah beberapa kali ikut IDDC. Ketika kita ikut IDDC selalu menyenangkan sih Pak. Pembawaan dari instrukturnya sangat menyenangkan. Lalu energi positifnya terasa dan dapat pengalaman-pengalaman hal baru. Walaupun saya sudah beberapa kali, saya selalu dapat hal baru yang bisa saya terapkan di perusahaan saya nanti.
Secara pribadi jelas Pak, saya mendapatkan ilmu yang beda. Karena itu adalah melekat pada diri saya. Saya bisa memahami cara berkendara, cara pengereman untuk mengurangi eksiden. Karena itu ketika mengalami kondisi tidak aman, seperti kan ini tidak aman nih turunan. Bagaimana sih kita harus mengantisipasi atau tindakan kita agar tidak terjadi insiden? Itu jelas akan melekat pada diri saya.
Eksistensi sumber daya manusia yang terampil sangat berperan dalam mendukung konektivitas transportasi dan kelancaran distribusi logistik, sehingga dapat mendorong pergerakan ekonomi dan meningkatkan kesejahteraan masyarakat di masa pandemi COVID-19. Konektivitas logistik pacu ekonomi.